In this video, I'd like to go through a technique that allows you to take a flip simulation and have it cling onto the surface of an object. In other words, I want the water to stick to the object and kind of roll around the various features of the water fountain. If we take a look at reference, we'll find that in the real world, this is exactly what happens. Water doesn't just go off the surface of things very easily. If it's moving slowly, it's going to try to wrap itself around whatever shapes it encounters. So we'll start with reference, and then I'll show you a few techniques of how you can go about that. And last but not least, if you enjoy this quick tip, then be sure to check out my course, Fluids 1, at cgforge.com. Let's dive into the reference. So here's some reference from the real world. We have a beautiful rock fountain, which was filmed by the Fountain Guru on YouTube. He has a lot of fantastic fountain reference if you're interested in that. And well, let's take a look at the behavior here. If we were to picture this as particles, we can safely say that a lot of this behavior is clinging onto the rock. If we were to take a look at the movement of the water, some of the particles are falling off of the rock and away from the surface, but a lot of them are sticking to the rock. And if we take a look at the rock found at the bottom left-hand side, we'll notice that sometimes the particles will cling onto the rock, it'll wrap around underneath a little bit, and then it will fall down with gravity on the underside of the rock. So in this situation, getting the particles to stick to the surface is going to be crucial for getting what we have here in our reference. Inside of Houdini, I have this fountain, and I've already sourced in everything we need for a basic flip simulation. If you don't know how to do that, then definitely check out Fluids 1, because it's kind of a lengthy conversation as to how to set up a basic flip simulation. But essentially what I have is I have these polygons that are floating here in midair. We can see it better if I do this sort of thing. These guys are going to emit particles, and that is going to be the basis for our flip simulation. So in other words, I just isolated a few areas where water spawns, and I want it to, like a fountain would, make water and then behave like it should. So we do that, we bring it into a DOP simulation right here. And if I was to do a play blast without doing anything special or fancy, just the default settings, we end up with something like this. So the problem, as you can imagine, is that we don't actually have these particles sticking to the surface, right? These particles are flying off of the edge, and they're not wrapping around like they should. We could see this very easily in this section right here, where that bowl curves around. You can imagine that the water, just like our reference, would actually be flowing along the surface there. So that's the problem. How can we fix this? I'm sure that many of you watching are savvy with Vex. So your first instinct might be to throw down a point VOP or something like that to basically create a custom force, taking the point closer to the collision. So let's draw this out and figure out the sort of things we're going to run into with this situation. So if I have a point, let's say, and I'm exaggerating here, but I have a point and I want it to search for a cluster of nearby points, and I want it to go in that direction. So the first thing we'll recognize is that we don't want to do this to all the points, because if I have a droplet that's way out here, I don't want the force impacting a droplet that is away from a certain threshold from the surface. So that's one thing we need to think about, right? We need to build in some kind of way to prevent that situation from happening. We only want the particles near the surface. So that's one thing. But let's say that we had a particle, it's right here, and it's going towards the surface here of the mesh. Okay, well, that particle is going to hit that collision object, and by default, guess what? It's going to want to bounce off that object. And the further we turn up that velocity, the more aggressive that bounce is going to be. So we need to also have a way of changing the physical properties of these particles so that they will not do that. However, that's going to come at the cost of not having as realistic motion when water hits a flat surface, like let's say down here, and it's supposed to bounce up. These particles are supposed to splash out and create droplets, right? And so, unfortunately, we're going to lose that ability to have the droplets bounce off the surface if we remove that bounce attribute. So that's not quite ideal either in this situation. Another thing to think about here is the fact that when we take a particle, and let's say a particle is near the surface, like right here in the middle, and we have this force that's trying to keep it stuck to the surface. Ignoring the bouncing issue here for a second, let's say that that particle is really trying to cling onto the surface. That's going to impact the way in which gravity affects that particle. And it can look really unnatural if we have too much of a force having it cling onto the fountain and not enough force pulling it down like what would typically happen with gravity. So we also need some kind of way to have a force compensating for the fact that that particle is sticking onto the surface to make it look natural. So as you can see, this situation at first glance appears like something simple, but actually has a lot of little things that can trip you up. So instead of doing all of that, there's actually a much better way of doing all of this, and that instead is using this gas stick on collision node. We're actually not going to use anything on the particles. We're going to use volumes in order to control the movements and behavior of this whole thing. So instead of building the wheel from scratch with VOPs, the wheel already exists. We just have to go through our gas nodes and magically all of our problems are solved. This is when it's really handy to know your nodes, because all of that functionality I just talked about is here in this gas stick on collision DOP. So what we have here is basically what I just talked about. The scale right here is asking us how closely should it match the collision velocity of the collision velocity volume. If you're not sure what that means, then check out my Pyro courses where I talk about collision fields and collision velocity fields. But basically put, that is saying instead of applying a force which relies on collision calculations to push it back where it should go, it's trying to find a force that's just uniform surrounding the object and trying to match that force. So for all intents and purposes, as you turn up this scale, it's going to stick more so to the object. The max distance is asking you how far away from the surface is this force allowed to go. And so we can do this in meters right here, or we can take a look at the VDB cells and figure out how many VDB blocks away from the surface to have this occurring. So that's the max cells versus the max distance right here. Heck, we can even have both of them happening right here as a way of determining where this goes. The bias is going to determine how quickly this effect falls off as we reach the maximum influence. So in other words, as we reach the max distance here of 0.05 meters, this force is going to become less and less strong, but it's going to be really strong right at the surface here. So that bias lets you control where that fall off occurs. And then the normal scale and the tangent scale are here to control that issue with gravity that I was talking about. So especially when it comes to the tangent scale, this is going to allow us to bring back that gravity effect and prevent the particles from just sticking onto the surface and not moving down naturally with gravity like it usually would. So there you go. That's basically all we have right here in these parameters. Let's check out the default settings, and then I want to adjust this to show you what it looks like when we turn this to a more dialed in situation. Oftentimes when I'm dialing in these settings, I like having a side simulation with simple geometry to figure out exactly what I'm looking for, because sometimes it helps just to dial in the settings that you like and then go to your main sim and apply it there. So anyway, we have flip and we have a sphere. This is the default behavior with no gas stick on collision happening. So this is no clinging whatsoever. Now let's take a look at what happens when we turn on the default settings for that gas node. And now as we can see, we have a much better result. This is way more natural to what we saw in our reference because it's sticking to the surface and it's giving us a more natural looking behavior towards the bottom here. However, in my opinion, I don't think it's sticking enough. And on top of that, we do have the issue of these particles appearing to slow down. In the last reference we had, the particles were going pretty fast due to gravity. But because we are sticking to the surface now, it's going to slow these guys down, and it almost makes it feel like a slow motion water effect. So let's start adjusting some of these parameters on the gas node. The first thing you'll want to do is figure out the scale and the max distance. The normal scale and the tangent scale are going to rely on these two parameters right here, so it's best to start in this general direction. The first thing I'll do is I will take the scale up to, let's say, about 0.5. We want more of that sticking behavior to occur. We already determined that. But I also want to focus on this max distance. And one great way to figure that out is to make a box, and we're going to template that box and set it to whatever that distance is, like let's say 0.05. Once we have that, we can visually see exactly where that is occurring. So looking at flip here, as we approach the surface, this is when that force begins to occur, about that far away from the surface visually. I think it's a little bit much, to be honest with you. So let's take that and instead set it to 0.025. Because if we were to think about what happens in the real world, we wouldn't have that sticking force happen very far away from the surface. So I like keeping this at a smaller value and then relying more so on the scale to keep things on the surface. Another benefit of having a smaller radius away from the surface is that it allows more droplets to occur. So if something bounces, it more easily escapes the influence of this effect, which is good. So let's do that, 0.025, and we will go here, 0.025. And before we start doing the bias and the normal tangent scale, let's do a play blast of what that does. And here we are. So I do like how it wraps around the fin right here. That to me seems more realistic. And we got that by turning up the scale. Now, this is, again, just getting very slow in areas along the back, so we can adjust that later. But one thing I like to do is turn on the bounce as well as the friction attributes or the friction physical properties on the particles. Because by default, a flip simulation does not use bounce or friction, so you have to turn those on manually. To do that, we can go to the flip solver, particle motion, behavior, and say use friction and bounce. And then to adjust that friction and bounce, we go to our flip object, properties, physical. We then go to our bounce and we can turn this up to, let's say, 0.5. Or if we want dynamic friction or friction, we can adjust that here as well. So let's say 0.25 on the friction, a little bit of bounce, and let's see what now happens when we do another flip book of that. And now we have this. We'll notice that this begins to look like a very viscous fluid, even though it's not viscous. And we also have more defined shapes when the water falls down along the sides here, which I believe would be more accurate to what would happen in the real world. We do lose detail, but I do think this is more realistic. So in general, I like having a little bit of that friction and bounce. Now, as for the bounce, we're also not getting these splashes going up, but we are getting more body to where the fluid accumulates. So for that reason, I like having a little bit of that bounce just to have that body there to the fluid. and a little bit of friction just to get those shapes occurring. So let's stop this. I'll go back here to the flip object, bounce at point, let's say 5, I think that was good. The bounce forward's fine. Friction, 0.1, dynamic friction scale, 0.5. And let's see what this does. Okay, and that looks great. Let's now move on to the normal scale and the tangent scale to get this looking less like a viscous fluid and more like actual water. If you're like me and you need to visualize things to understand them, this is what we're talking about when we talk about the normal versus the tangent. Let's say that this portion right here is the geometry, okay? And let's say that we have some water here in the blue going along the normal. So we have a droplet right here and it's going in this normal direction. When we affect that normal scale, we're affecting the velocity that's going this way. When we affect the tangent scale, we are affecting the velocity that is going this way, which in the case of our particles, if they are falling down with gravity along the tangent, then that's what we want to speed up in order for this to look like gravity is acting normally. Right away, you'll notice that we have something strange happen when we turn up the tangent scale. So let's say that I want more velocity heading in that tangent direction, right? You would think to turn up the tangent scale because we want more velocity heading in that direction. So if we overdrive that to a value of 5 and we go forward, we have this slow motion effect now happening to our particles. And this doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense, actually, because of the fact that these particles should be outside of the max distance, and yet they are still being affected by this tangent scale. Plus, as we turned up the tangent scale, it slowed down everything. So it's kind of having this opposite effect that you would intuitively think. So this is where I think the developers might have been a little bit sloppy in how this was all built. Basically, the tangent and normal scale is inverse what you would intuitively think, and this bias is going to impact particles outside of this max distance. So if I take this bias to 0.1 as an example, and I go through this whole thing again, we will notice that the particles speed up, and they are less affected by these values here. And they're still affected by it, but they're less affected by it. And then once the particles hit the surface, that's when these guys really start kicking in. So we could see that happen, right? It goes down, it hits the surface, and then it starts slowing down because we have a high tangent scale. And just to exaggerate this a bit, let's say the tangent scale is at 10. We go ahead and press play. It does not affect these guys as much at the top because our bias is 0.1, but as soon as it hits, it slows down these particles quite a bit, and then it breaks and it starts freaking out like right here. So you can't go too crazy with that tangent scale. I'd say a value of 10 is beyond what you should do for something like that, and it's something to watch out for. And if you do want more of that cohesion, I think it's better to use the friction parameters instead of a high tangent scale. However, we can say that a bias of 0.1 is great because we don't want to affect the particles out here as much. So that bias of 0.1 is awesome. Let's see what happens though when we turn that tangent scale down to, let's say, a value of 0.1. So we'll make this a very small value instead of a large value. What does that do? And now we're starting to get somewhere closer to where we want to be. This now actually goes faster along the tangent, which is awesome. It's probably going a bit too fast, to be honest with you, so we might do 0.2 instead of 0.1. But there you go. That gives you a really good sense of what this is all about. So real quickly, let me also bring back the tangent scale, set that to 0.5 or 1, which is the default. And let's see what happens when we overdrive the normal scale and then when we turn the normal scale down. Here's the normal scale at 5. which is actually getting us closer to what we want. The force going towards flip is less, so that means the tangent force is having more of an impact, right? Here's what it looks like when the normal scale is at 0.1. And now this is the normal scale at 0.1. Less of an effect, less of a noticeable impact like it was for the tangent scale. However, in theory, I suppose this is supposed to increase the amount of direction towards the surface. So finally, to wrap all this up, what I'll do is this. Normal scale will go up a little bit. That got us closer to what we liked. The tangent scale, if we turn this down, that got us closer to what we need. So I'll say 0.5. And with this combination, let's see what happens. And now we have success. If we put that on the fountain, we end up with something like this. And we're good to go. Anyway, there you have it, guys. That is the gas stick-on collision. It's a very, very important node. Not only can you use this for flip simulations, but you can also use this for pyro. You can use this for creating interesting magic effects. This particular node is very useful and not talked about as often as it should. So if you guys enjoyed this quick tip, be sure to check out Fluids1 at cgforge.com. I have over 6 hours of high quality content just like this on the topic of fluids. And if you're interested in anything else as a beginner in pyro, I have you covered. There's all kinds of things to learn at cgforge.com. Thanks for watching. I hope that you have a great day and good luck with your flip simulations.